Funding for Inner Compass is provided by Calvin College.
The life that's unfolding,
the world that awaits,
gifts that are yours to explore,
and God's to use.
It's all happening here at Calvin.
Oh, hello. Welcome to Inner Compass. Imagine your life climbing through the tops of trees. Not any trees, but rainforest trees, the tall ones. Your sons are along with you, and you've invented the equipment in order to get to the top. And perhaps you've had a snack of Amazon bugs. This is the life of the dedicated scientist mom, and she'll join us today on Inner Compass.
From the campus of Calvin College, this is Inner Compass, exploring how people use faith and ethics to guide them through critical issues of today.
My guest today is Margaret Lowman, author of It's a Jungle Up There, More Tales from the Treetops, about her adventures as a scientist raising two boys in the jungles of Australia, Peru, Africa, the Americas, and the South Pacific. Welcome, Margaret.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
They also call you Canopy Meg.
They do. I got that nickname from 5th and 6th graders from doing a lot of school talks.
That's a great name, and it's because you have done a lot of research in the canopies of the rainforest, correct?
Believe it or not, I was about the first person that studied the tops of trees, because most people study forests from the ground level.
But yet, so many of the species are actually living in the tops of trees.
Right, and that's kind of been a new discovery for a lot of us in science. In fact, when I first climbed trees, I never went to the top of a tree to find everything. I just went up there because I thought it would be something different. And lo and behold, we found some half of the world's biodiversity is supposed to be living up there, and we're still discovering new things.
I think that in your book you write that we've only discovered 1.5 million of the 30 million different kinds of species that live in the treetops, correct?
Exactly. Of 30 million that live on the earth, at least. Now some people are saying up to 100 million. But of those millions and millions, 50% is supposed to live in the tops of trees. So get your harness.
Right. Well, in fact, I've done the zip line.
Oh, good.
But it is fascinating to be up in the treetops. It's a whole different viewpoint.
Right. And when you think about it, it makes sense. The fruits are up there, the flowers. So, of course, all the insects and birds are up there too.
But not many people go up there because there's a difficulty getting into the treetops. But you've created gadgets, isn't that right?
That's been most of my scientific career, in a sense, is developing techniques to make it safe for students and researchers to study up there.
How did you first start into that? I picture you as an engineer now, trying to make contraptions for climbing up trees.
I think more I was a naive graduate student. And my first gadgets were a harness and a slingshot, and I was in Australia at the time. I actually made the slingshot in the shop of University of Sydney physical plant, and that's because slingshots were illegal in Australia, believe it or not.
Are you talking about the slingshot?
Yes.
But how does that get you into the treetops?
You have to get a line up over the branch to make it safe to climb. So you use the slingshot to get the rope up, and then you can use the harness and the hardware to climb on the rope.
Okay, so then do you like hoist yourself up?
You can use mountaineering gadgets like called Jumars, the same thing they use for caving or going up Mount Everest.
But and how tall are the trees that you were climbing with these gadgets?
A whole range. In Florida, they're very short, maybe 40 feet high, but in Africa or Asia, they can be up to 200 feet high.
Wow.
Yeah.
Now, you also used cranes and some other kind of equipment that you sort of redeployed.
Right, and as I moved through my career and perhaps became more widely published, I was able to have a larger budget. And
so you didn't have to be shooting the slingshot, right?
So gadgets like hot air balloons and construction cranes are all more expensive but better. The hot air balloon is my favorite. It's kind of like being Dorothy in the Wizard of Oz.
Oh, you can picture
and
that.
That was designed by some French colleagues. It's about $1 million apparatus, and of course it floats over the canopy with the delicate mechanisms of operating a hot air balloon. The driver can lower us on the top of a tree. So actually it's the only way to get to those very uppermost branches, which you couldn't climb to because
they're so small.
Right, exactly, and that's fascinating.
So when you're at the top of those trees, you're using binoculars to look down. What kinds of other equipment do you need to have then to see the sort of life that's in the top of trees?
Mostly it's up close and personal. So if anything, we're always careful about ants or snakes or things that, believe it or not, do live up there in great numbers. So we are sampling with nets, or we're clipping flowers for collections in museums, or even sometimes getting little buds for perfume companies that sponsor the research.
Do you get to use the hot air balloon anytime you want to, or just on particular assignments?
In that case, the hot air balloon is a very collaborative effort where about 50 scientists pool their research funding, and so we only use that in a very highly organized fashion. But other techniques like Canopy Walkways, which I really love, are available 24/7 once they've been built.
Now, are you the originator of the Canopy Walkway?
I am. I guess that's my claim to fame in this gadgetry world, but I did devise the first Canopy Walkway while I was working at an ecotourism lodge in Australia, and then came back to the States and built the first one in North America on the campus of Williams College, where I was teaching at the time.
Now, a Canopy Walkway takes you from one very tall space to another very tall space through the trees, and how far are you off the ground generally?
It can be variable. The neat thing about a walkway is that you can make different levels. You can go through the mid canopy and the upper canopy and even up a tower to the emergence, as we call it. The limitation is that it's a permanent structure and you can't move it.
Right. But it's made out of wood and rope.
Hopefully. We tend to build out of natural elements. There are other companies now, as it's becoming more widely used, that go for stainless steel and some.
But that seems not right.
I know, it's a little noisy too.
Right.
So you know how construction is. People change their ways and their needs a little bit. But the neat thing about a walkway is they have been very instrumental in rainforest conservation, because indigenous villages might build a walkway instead of taking on a logger's contract, and that gives them a sustainable income from the forest.
You write that wonderful story about an island in the Samoa where they had to build a school, and this government said you have to pay for it.
Right.
And they had a couple of options, one being ecologically friendly, that they really didn't know about yet, or one was to deforest with logging. How did you get involved with them, and how did the outcome happen in that particular case?
That was a really neat story, and a colleague of mine who does research there contacted me because he knew that I did build Canopy Walkways, and because he was aware of the dilemma that the chiefs on that island had through his own research experiences in the South Pacific. He said, why don't we go there and talk to them about this idea? So
he was doing research in another area?
He was doing research on that island on ethnobotany. He's a person that studies medicinal plants. And so the neat thing in the scientific community is it's all interlinked. Yes. We know each other, I suppose, the same way that people in the world of football all know each other. So it's easy to perhaps find out what would be a good solution to a problem that might occur on the other side of the world. And that led to a number of walkways going up since then, in hopes of perhaps finding these ways of funding local economies without cutting down the trees.
And did it pay the debt so that they could fund their school?
Within 2 years.
No!
Oh, isn't that great?
That is great.
It's so neat. And now they have a little scholarship fund. They can send kids away for, extra education. They have a little bit of disposable income from their walkway.
And how much more interesting to have a canopy walk where you can learn something within this village, which is related now to education, which is funding their education process. It just feels like the right thing to do, doesn't it?
Exactly.
Now, you took your children along to all of these, many of these adventures, so that their education would be enhanced.
Right. It was kind of a dictatorship in a sense, and I was a single mom, and so they couldn't stay home alone. But the neat thing was, by joining Mom with her research, I think it led to a lot of family bonding and some really special experiences. So as we all look back, it was extraordinary fun.
So did they resist at all at first, or did they become really willing partners in what sounds to me like very exotic places to be in pretty unusual settings?
Right. They became pretty willing partners. They were really good kids. I give them so much credit, because obviously if they hadn't been willing partners, it might have influenced my career. But once or twice I can remember James in 7th grade wanting to stay home for a party or something going on, and he had to go to the Amazon instead. But he looks back and laughs about that, and some of the kids teased him that he didn't get a car in high school, but he got a blowgun. But even still, he says now that it was worth it.
You have apparently an excellent blowgun collection. Isn't that right?
It's kind of, what else would you have coming home from the Amazon?
And you write in your book that Eddie's goals at age 9, a short-term goal, and you must have, think of all these cool things you're teaching them about short-term goals, long-term goals. Eddie's short-term goal was to finish his book report when it was due. The medium goal was become the 4th level at camp. And then at age 9, his long-term goal was to get a PhD.
I know, that's so cute. So you can tell the crowd he was hanging out with.
Yes, you can tell. So that meant something. A PhD at age 9 meant something to him, didn't it?
It is interesting.
But now, I think as parents, we all want our children to have big visions, worthy dreams, as Parker Palmer says. And it appears to have instilled a bigger vision of the world in your children.
I think as a mom, I would say that traveling overseas was a very valuable experience for my kids. Living in a place where there isn't electricity and there's not a hairdryer or a Nintendo game or a television set really changes your worldview. And so if anything, I think that gives you a new sense of values and takes you out of the world here, which is so easy to get immersed. So perhaps that was the best gift of all.
Your children are now in their 20s.
Right, oh my gosh.
And you were doing this, 15, 16, 17 years ago. How open was the scientific community to your bringing your children along?
Not at all at first. In fact, I got criticized by my male colleagues, of course, about having children on the field expeditions at times. And I also got criticized about writing books for the public, because in science, we don't have to do that to get tenure. So it's like, why are you doing this extra activity? It's not necessary type of attitude.
Concentrate on that scientific journal.
Right. But subsequently, a lot of my male colleagues call me now all the time now, I'm taking my 5-year-old to the rainforest, what should I pack? And I think people recognize that it didn't deter things. It really actually enhanced a lot of activities. Kids can find beetles much quicker than adults. They
can scramble places.
Better tree climbers. There were a lot of good attributes. And I was pretty careful. I didn't, for example, take my kids to Africa where there were a lot of unknowns for me, but I did take them to rainforests where I had a sense of knowledge about what was in store and what we needed to have with us and whether or not they could drink the water or take the water or do whatever was safe.
Now, were you a homeschool in the sense that you were a jungle schooler?
Not entirely.
Okay.
I did limit my research to activities that kept me that minimized my time in the forest. We only went for 2 weeks maximum. I worked pretty carefully with their school. They obviously got their jungle training in a lot of extra science, but we had a nice barter system, I might call it, where I did a lot of school programs in return for pulling the kids out, and they always had extra assignments. The math teacher would have them do something counting army ants, and the science teacher would have them bring a report back, and the English teacher would make sure they brought some special essay back. So we worked it out as best as possible, but they couldn't really stay away for too long because they were maintaining the public school track.
Right, so you were able to meld that together to benefit your family life, your research life, in their school life.
Right. I was determined to do that because this is amazing. I never had a woman professor in science. That just shows you how things are changing.
Right.
And I wanted to do that as a role model for my students. I thought, gosh, what kind of world is it where we think that women in science shouldn't have families in order to make it work? So the only way to change that is perhaps do it ourselves.
And you also made some choices along the way. You had written your first book in the Treetops, and it had been on the front of the New York Times book review, and it got and that reader loved it and wrote about it, and you said it just took off.
Right. That was a life-changing experience in a sense, because my book was published by Yale University Press. It was what they call a trade book for the public, but with a peer-reviewed scientific publisher. And so when
peer review means that other scientists are reviewing it for the quality of the science.
And checking it, because that's what scientists need to do in order to have good science. So when it got a cover review, they were ecstatic, and I was too. And you know what, it taught me that review probably did more for rainforest conservation than all of my technical publications. So the moral of the story is, in science, perhaps like religion, we should tithe a bit of our time to educating the public, because if we don't, they won't understand the issues and we won't really save what we care about.
That was such a holistic approach. You wrote in your book, communication about science is as important as the science itself.
Right. What good is it if it's sitting in a dusty shelf?
Right. And you want people to be excited about rainforest conservation or other kinds of conservation, because if you get a mass group behind it, they can write the legislature, they can make a movement themselves, they can change their habits, how they're using the environment. All of that would then benefit the sort of things that you're passionate about in your science work.
Exactly.
Well, then after this book, you get an offer to write another book. You're kind of a hot author. And you say, not now, because you've got teenage boys.
Right.
Tell us about that decision as a mother and a scientist.
Yeah, that was tough, because I think, oh my gosh, all that advance that I could have used to buy a rainforest.
And maybe it won't come again.
But it is true that I think, you know, as I look back, the teenagers are perhaps the most demanding as a mom, because you need to keep in touch with your kids, and it is time consuming to try to keep track of all the changes and things going on in their heads. And so I didn't take a big book offer. I needed to keep my job, of course, in the regular world and keep up my science. And I did go back and do a subsequent book with an academic press again. And in this case, took my time, and it was slower, and it obviously has less marketing aura than some of the more popular presses, but it was a good experience because the boys co-authored it with me.
Right, and that's the book that we're talking about today.
Right.
And you have pictures of your sons in the book. They've got journal articles, journal entries that they wrote in the book, and they're describing their own viewpoint in this journey of science with their mother. Did you have to convince the press, to the publisher, to say, I really want to co-author this with my sons? Did they say, oh no?
A little bit.
Did they?
But I was lucky that the science editor at Yale is a woman, and I think she had her own experiences raising children, so she was particularly sympathetic. And I also explained to her that in the world of science, we usually co-author with our research associates, those students or postdocs or graduate students that help you with your research. Right. It's ethical to share the publication with them, and so I thought, gosh, the boys shared so much of my data collection that it would be ethical to share it with them, and quite frankly, they were better writers than I.
They are good writers.
They had fun little perspectives on things that I didn't think about, what we ate or how much mud there was. And so in a sense, maybe that would make it a little more believable for other parents to think about ways to take their kids outside.
So this book is accessible in so many ways. From a science perspective, if someone wanted to read about your work and the sort of hard science that's involved, but also there's this great accessible portion by your sons who write about going to Waldorf Astoria for the Explorers Club, which has people like Edmund Hillary there and Buzz Aldrin, and you're getting invited to be a part of that Explorers Club. But then they read about the menu. Right. They write about the menu. It says roasted termite, Madagascar hissing cockroaches, braised earthworms sandwiched in snow peas.
That's right.
And that is
a good way of expanding their horizons.
Right. Do people really, there's a picture of them here eating tarantula tempura. Does it really taste good? Do the insects really taste good?
Tastes great. I hate to tell you that, but when you think about it, many cultures eat insects except Americans, and for most cultures it's about the most economical and green diet you can think of, because it doesn't take fossil fuel, it doesn't take fertilizer to raise a whole population of little termites under your bed in a box. So get ready for the next generation.
A food source right under your bed.
High protein, low cholesterol. I'm sure some doctor will get hold of this and make $1 million out of a new recipe book.
But are they clean? Are they healthy? I mean, don't you get diseases from eating bugs?
Not at all.
Okay.
Think about it. In a sense, if they're coming out of nature, and quite frankly, the chef at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York evidently has a reputation that he has his own sources of getting all sorts of sustainable foods for this particular Explorers Club banquet.
Really? Well, it was a fascinating article, and it really is going to stretch us culinarily.
That's right.
I believe. Now, you also like to educate in schools, and you bring people along on some of your excursions, don't you?
Right, I do. I've done a lot of distance learning. I was really fortunate to work with Bob Ballard, who discovered the Titanic, and we teamed up to do distance learning in the rainforest canopy. He did it undersea, obviously. I did it at the tops of the trees, and we're able to reach millions of kids that way through a project called the Jason Expedition. And subsequently, I've done some National Geographic television, and most importantly, maybe speaking at schools, talking on radio shows where moms can hear and think about ways that we can all share nature with our kids, because I do think that's becoming a missing link in the lives of a lot of children. And when you think about it, we all need to understand our home, and it's not the electricity and the water out of the tap, but it really is the ecosystem where you live.
Living in almost in harmony with the biosystem and understanding that better.
And understanding that we all have to take care of the planet a little bit more than we might have done in the past.
Do you think that ecotourism, this idea of taking a vacation with your family or friends to a part of the world and learning about the environment there, is a good idea for families?
I think it's great. And over the years, I have evolved a cohort of families who have traveled with me. I tend to open up my rainforest research expeditions to families simply because I was doing it myself and I needed to practice what I preached. And I have moms who write me back and say how important that was in bonding their family, getting the kids away from that screen at home,
whatever it is, computer
really
screen,
difficult.
TV screen.
Sometimes takes maybe immersion in the middle of the jungle, and it's not a bad thing to learn how to use a blowgun or see how people take plants and make medicines out of them. It's a fascinating way to travel, and so I tend to take 2 or 3 trips a year now that I put on my website, and people just call me or sign up and come along, because a lot of times it really helps parents get back with their kids. I think to share a unique experience is a really valuable thing as a family.
Right, it creates memories that become part of the family story.
Yes, exactly.
In the past 25 years, what do you see as the biggest changes for women in science?
Gosh, they're still changing, I hope to see, because we really have a lot of glass ceiling hurdles out there yet to be overcome. But I do see women having family and combining that with career, which is important, I think, in terms of being role models. I see women getting more involved in things like muddy boot research that I do. I see women climbing into leadership roles, but not very often. That's still a big hurdle we need to overcome. A recent study showed that less than 10% of women are chairs or heads of departments in science in my field of ecology, and unfortunately their paycheck is about 22% less than a comparative male paycheck. So those are the next hurdles yet to be overcome.
Can you put child care expenses in the grants that you write?
No, that's
you can't.
something I'm advocating for at this point in time with Earthwatch and National Science Foundation. You can put a boat driver in, or maybe a camel maintenance person if you're out in Africa, but child care is still an extra. There was one amazing woman in France I read that actually left in her will an amount of money for French researchers to have child care. I thought that was really forward thinking, but it's not acceptable yet.
Well, that seems to be an important issue to change,
Yes.
because if you want people to be good parents and to be involved in their discipline,
Right.
they want to take care of their children well, whether it's taking them along or having very good a person's taking care of the children at home, or supporting their spouse who may have to have child care needs as well if they're working
Right.
outside the home.
Exactly, it's a big hurdle, and that was a big limiting factor for me. Trying to afford to take the kids on my research was always a big extra that obviously had its paybacks in terms
Right.
of family values, but it still wasn't easy.
No, but it was worth it.
Right, very worth it.
My guest today has been Margaret Lowman, author of It's a Jungle Up There, More Tales from the Treetops. I'm Shirley Hoogstra, and thank you for watching Inner Compass.